Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Martin Klimke and I'm the PI for the Humanities Research Fellowship program, and we're very happy to welcome you to today's event, which is a new format that we're launching here. And we really want to give credit where credit is due. The panelists came up with this particular format themselves, and it's a reflection of what we want to do in the fellowship program, for the community, to provide a platform to have these particular debates in a concentrated fashion, about specific debates or issues, hot button issues in people's fields. So I'm very happy to welcome you to what is called Debates in Arab Intellectual History, New Perspectives, with 5 renowned experts in this field, and the format will be explained by our expert moderator and former Dean of Arts and Humanities and Professor of Philosophy, Taneli Kukkonen, who's joining us very remotely today, and we're very thankful for him to take the lead on this wonderful event. So thanks for coming and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Again, I'm Taneli Kukkonen, Professor of Philosophy at NYU Abu Dhabi, and I'll be moderating this esteemed panel. A quick note on just the procedure. We have a very compact hour in which to hear no fewer than 4 presentations and squeeze some Q&A in. I have checked beforehand with our panelists, and none of them are averse to letting this stretch a little bit further. So I'm just going to come right out and say that as long as we get our 4 presentations in by 6 p.m., I'll be satisfied, and we can then make sure that we have some time for questions afterwards if it turns out that it's going to take us closer to the 6 just to hear what our panelists have to say. By way of introducing our topic, I'd just like to go back to pretty much the beginning of my own studies, where I first learned about the study of classical Greece, that it was characterized as an agonistic culture, which is to say that striving for victory in all matters was seen as a cultural good. And then I was very excited to learn that this was in fact at the background of the sophistic movement, which preceded the development of Western philosophy as we know it. That's to say that you advance the cause of intellectual culture, you advance the cause of what was true and right and good by in fact getting at your adversaries as aggressively as was necessary, by in fact kind of joining forces in examining the assumptions that others held in reasoned debate. You were able to again advance not only your individual good but the public good as well. And so so this characterizes Mediterranean culture. Through that, it of course came to shape the very birth of the university system as we know it. It's in medieval kinds of Latin medieval forms of the art of disputation, the continuation of the Platonic and Aristotelian schools, that many of the processes and kind of institutions of Western higher education came into being, including the doctoral dissertation. And so perhaps it came as less of a surprise than it should have when in the course of my own studies in Islamic intellectual culture, debate and disputation were everywhere. It was just a kind of a matter of fact that, okay, that any time you wanted to learn about some subject in Islamic intellectual history, you'd end up delving sooner or later into a debate or a disputation, either orally held or written up in the form of a treatise, any way you turned. But it's a signal feature of again Islamic intellectual culture that debate and disputation were practically a form of life. And what is very exciting in current research into Islamic intellectual history is that there's been, as in many other sub sort of fields, there's been a reflective turn to be looking at the very forms of debate and disputation that took place. And so when our panelists suggested an event where we would be hopscotching through the centuries, the Islamic 2nd, 4th, 6th, and 8th centuries, to be looking at particular ways in which debate functioned in certain kind of intellectual environments. I was incredibly excited to take part and to be learning from our esteemed panelists. So we'll be proceeding through again in the Common Era, now the 8th, the 10th, the 12th, and the 14th centuries in quick succession. We'll begin with John Zaleski, who's one of our Humanities Research Fellows for NYU Abu Dhabi on interreligious debates in 2nd or 8th century Baghdad. And if I'm not much mistaken, I'm going to learn much more about a topic that, in fact, was the topic of my very, very first course in Islamic studies. And I'm not even kidding you. This very debate was the very first thing that I started learning about when I delved into Islamic studies, and I got a B. Let's see if what kind of a teacher John is to us. So thank you very much, and John, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Martin, and thank you, Taneli, for that thought-provoking introduction. I'll try to at least get a B+ on this presentation. Okay, so as Taneli indicated, the main debate that I'll be discussing today took place in Baghdad between the Abbasid Caliph al-Mahdi and a Christian bishop around the year 782 or 165 in the Hijri calendar. This was a pretty good time to be a bishop, especially if you were Timothy I, head of the Church of the East, the largest Christian community in Iraq. Timothy had warm relations with the Abbasid caliphs, whose political authority he unabashedly supported, and from whose generous hands he received funding for churches, monasteries, and most importantly, books. Indeed, Timothy's relationship with the caliphs was remarkably intellectual in nature. More than once, Timothy met with al-Mahdi to discuss a new translation of Aristotle, to debate the nature of God, or to argue over the interpretation of the Bible and the Quran. Timothy described one of these debates in a letter to a friend of his, written in Syriac. The debate took place in Arabic, but a record of it comes in the Syriac letter. According to Timothy, at the end of the debate, he and al-Mahdi discussed a parable, the parable of the precious pearl. Through this parable, Timothy expressed pluralistic ideas about the competing truth claims of Christianity and Islam. Now, much is said about pluralism these days, so I should explain what I mean by it in this paper. By pluralism, I mean not only the idea that Christianity and Islam can happily coexist, but also the idea that Christian and Islamic truth claims can coexist. That is, that both religions possess intellectual validity. Examining the debate of Timothy and al-Mahdi allows us to see more precisely what this pluralism looked like in the Abbasid era. Before analyzing their discussion, however, I want to consider its afterlife. Through years of retelling, the parable of the precious pearl, along with other similar stories from the medieval Islamic world, became the parable of the ring, made famous in the 18th century play Natan der Weise, composed by Gotthold Ephraim Lessing. It's not my purpose to trace the path by which Timothy's parable of the pearl became Lessing's ring parable, but comparing the two parables allows us to consider what pluralism meant in the context of an interreligious encounter in the early Abbasid period, and how this differed from modern ideals of religious pluralism that emerged in the Enlightenment. So let me begin with the work closest to our own time. Lessing's play, Natan der Weise, tells the story of a wise Jewish merchant named Nathan, who lived in Jerusalem in the time of Saladin. One day, Saladin summoned Nathan to debate with him whether Judaism, Christianity, or Islam was the true religion. Nathan answered the Sultan's challenge with a parable. A father, as Nathan said, had a precious ring, and its bearer would be made pleasing to God. The father made 2 exact copies of the ring and gave one of the 3 rings to each of his 3 sons. Naturally, each son was convinced that he had received the real inheritance, and eventually the sons had to appeal to a judge to determine who had been given the original ring. Yet the judge pointed out that none of the sons acted in a manner pleasing to God. Perhaps the father had given each of them a copy, and the true ring was possessed by none. Now, Lessing intended this parable as a plea for tolerance and religious pluralism, befitting an age of enlightenment. The message of his play is that neither Christianity, nor Judaism, nor Islam can make a valid claim to be the true religion. Jews, Christians, and Muslims will simply have to get along, each of us seeking to please God according to our own lights. Now back to the 8th century. Timothy's parable at first glance seems to be very similar to the parable told by Lessing. At the end of the debate, as related by Timothy, al-Mahdi pressed him on his claim to follow the true religion. Was he sure that Christ was the divine word, the Son of God? Imagine Timothy told al-Mahdi, a house. In this house, a precious pearl appears in the middle of the night. All the inhabitants of the house will search for the pearl, grasping at objects in the dark. Each person will believe that he has found the true pearl, even though only one will actually have discovered it, while the others will be clutching a piece of glass, a rock, or a clump of dirt. Only when the light of day breaks will the true possessor of the pearl be known. It's the same with us, Timothy says. Here I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint so that we can look at the dialogue between Timothy and al-Mahdi. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. So it's the same with us, Timothy says, and I quote, "Here in this world of death and darkness, the pearl of the true faith has fallen in our midst. It is surely in the hands of one of us, and each of us considers the precious stone to be in his own hands. Yet in the next world, when darkness and death will pass away, and the precise light of truth will shine, then the possessors of the pearl will rejoice." So far, it seems, Lessing would be pleased with Timothy's parable. Timothy expresses what seems to be a radical agnosticism. Although everyone claims to possess the true faith, the actual owner of the true faith will not be known in this world, but in the world to come. The doctrinal assertions of Christians and Muslims, he suggests, represent a grasping for knowledge, but they are just as likely to grasp stone as pearl. Christian and Islamic truth claims thus appear to have equal standing because they are equally unverifiable. Nevertheless, when the caliph presses Timothy on the meaning of the parable, Timothy interprets it in a way that is not pluralistic in the sense envisioned by Lessing in the 18th century. So al-Mahdi says, "Are the possessors of the pearl not known in this world?" Timothy responds, "The possessors of the pearl are partly known in this world. Just as the shimmerings of a pearl give forth light even in the gloom of the night, so also flashes of the true faith gleam even in the gloom and darkness of the night of this present world." As Timothy goes on to explain, God has indeed left evidence of the true faith, the miracles of Christ and his disciples, which testify to the truth of the Christian religion. Now, of course, al-Mahdi is not convinced by this. He responds by saying, "By God, we believe that we are the possessors of the pearl, and that it is in our hands." Timothy then concludes with a tactful and indeed pluralistic message. "Amen, O King, and God grant that we too may share it with you, and rejoice with you in the shimmering and gleaming of the pearl." This exchange suggests what I would call a weak pluralism. Neither Timothy nor al-Mahdi sees the claims of Christians and Muslims as having equal validity. On the contrary, each of them believes that he has sufficient evidence to establish his own confession as the true faith. Nevertheless, they admit a degree of uncertainty. In the gloom of this world, it is not fully apparent who possesses the precious pearl. This partial uncertainty allows Timothy to make the tactful statement that ends the debate, his prayer that God grant them to share in the pearl of the true faith. This weak pluralism differs substantially from the Enlightenment strong pluralism promoted by Lessing, in which Christian and Islamic claims are equally valid because equally lacking in proof. In fact, it is weak pluralism that allowed the Abbasid era interreligious debates, of which the encounter between Timothy and al-Mehdi was but one example. If the interlocutors in these debates had no confidence in their views, their exchange of rational and scriptural arguments would seem futile. Yet because Timothy and al-Mehdi are in agreement that the identity of the true faith is not obvious or self-evident, they are able to listen to, respect, and even show appreciation for each other's arguments. To conclude, this dynamic between Timothy and al-Mehdi sheds light on the purpose of interreligious debates in the Abbasid world. The written descriptions of these debates often served an apologetic aim, and here we really have to distinguish between the written record of the debate and the act of debate itself. In recounting his exchange with the Caliph, Timothy sought to show Christians how they might respond to Islamic challenges to their faith. And this was part of a broader effort to strengthen Christian resolve in the face of a politically privileged and rapidly growing religious rival. Yet I would suggest that the act of debate serves to reinforce what I've called weak pluralism. Through debate, all participants confirmed their own religious convictions. They achieved not the conversion of their opponents, but rather a mutual appreciation for their shared effort to identify and understand the true faith. It was this shared striving for the truth, albeit with conflicting understandings of the nature of this goal, that marked the pluralistic ethos of early Abbasid Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That was entirely fascinating, and I will freely confess a lot more accessible than my German professor's introduction to the same topic some almost 30 years ago, with all due deference to Martin. Our next speaker is my dear colleague and the program head of Arab Crossroads Studies, Professor Maurice Pomerantz, who will take us to Abu Ḥayyān al-Tawḥīdī and the 4th/10th century. Take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me? My talk today is entitled The Limits of Reasoned Speech, Abu Ḥayyān al-Tawḥīdī's Narrations of Intellectual Debates. Now, Abu Ḥayyān al-Tawḥīdī was an author formed by the Islamic hate culture of intellectual debate, who at the same time was a prescient observer of its shortcomings. Aptly called the literature of the philosophers and the philosopher of the literateurs, Adib al-Falasifa wa Filosof al-Udaba, Tawḥīdī was witness and participant in many of the more important intellectual debates of this 4th/10th century. Born between the 2nd and 3rd decades of this century, just as the central power of Baghdad was failing, Tawḥīdī spent his long life between Baghdad and Western Iran, circulating between the courts that had grown up in the shadow of Abbasid political decentralization. This afforded him the opportunity to observe, record, and portray the language and conduct of the greatest learned persons of that age. Attuned to the political world around him, Tawḥīdī was also a Sufi. And through his works, we can sometimes detect the standpoint of the stranger, the gharib, whose alienation from power allowed him to see the failings of the political world in which he was active. Tawḥīdī's works are studded with many brilliant accounts of intellectual debates, and these have most often been the focus of modern scholars. In particular, one thinks of Tawḥīdī's remarkable portrayal of the debate between the philosopher and logician Mata ibn Yunus and the grammarian Abu Sa'id as-Sirafi, which has, rightly or wrongly, stood for some as an exemplar of the contention between the two fields of intellectual endeavor, logic and grammar, and the topic of a fine article by my colleague Wenchen Wang. In a departure from this positive trend, I would like to consider another debate described by Abu Ḥayyān al-Tawḥīdī of a very different character. My aim this evening will be to recount a debate gone awry and ask what are some of the underlying motives that Tawḥīdī had in portraying this debate in the way that he does. How does this portrayal shed light on the culture of debate and its assumptions? And what, after all, are the limits of rational debate? Now, the debate is one that took place in the year 360-970 in Baghdad during the month of Ramadan. It's important to note that Tawḥīdī himself was not present at this debate. And he does not mention the source of the story explicitly. However, Tawḥīdī's teacher and friend, Abu Hamid al-Mawarudi may well be its source. He was present. Tawḥīdī tells us that the debate was held at the Majlis of the Buyid Emir of Baghdad, is a Dawla Bakhtiyar. And he mentions many of the names of the guests, among whom are a list of luminaries of the intellectual world of that era. Among them are al-Jassas, the famed Hanafi jurist, Ibn Qab al-Ansari, Ibn Maruf, the well-known Qadi of Baghdad. He describes how the men are all seated in an Iwan, a large hall, and at the Sadr, which one can think of as the head of the Majlis, a place of honor, are those who have been expressly invited, the principals, as well as Abu al-Wafa Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Muhandis al-Buzjani, who is serving as the event's organizer. And Tawḥīdī calls him Naqib al-Majlis wa Murattib al-Qawm, the organizer of it all. Of course, al-Buzjani, for scholars of Tawḥīdī, is very famous. He's the patron for whom Tawḥīdī authored his most famous work, Kitab al-Imta' wal-Mu'anasa, the Book of Delight and Conviviality. Now, the main invitee of this event and the topic of the entire episode is the great jurist Abu Abdullah al-Basri, who was at the time the leader of the powerful Bahashimiyya school of the Mu'tazila. And al-Basri's rival at this debate was Ali ibn Isa al-Rumani al-Ikhshidi, who was also a famed judge and expert in Arabic language, and grammar, and theology. Al-Rumani had composed numerous refutations of the main proponents of the Bahashimiyya school, the Basran school, actually, Abu Ali al-Jubai and Abu Hashim al-Jubai. And the scene was set for a true intellectual showdown. Al-Rumani, whom Tawḥīdī calls the righteous sheikh, for after all, Tawḥīdī was his student, opens the debate with appropriate decorum. He describes how the Majlis is honored by the presence of the great Abu Abdullah al-Basri on account of his nobility, sharaf. He also states a key principle. The debate will be protected from error on account of the multitude of knowledgeable and judicious men who are taking part. And he adds, not every age of man has been fortunate to have such scholars as these among the attendees. Al-Rumani then proceeds to state the reason for this debate. And he states, there has long been a question between ourselves and this sheikh, pointing to Abu Abdullah al-Basri, which has caused them, meaning his school, to claim that we, our school, are apostates and sinners, and to pour out their enmity upon us and our followers. So I will begin by asking Abu Abdullah to champion his own position however he wishes. For the subject is religion, and those who are knowledgeable ought to delve into its depth. إنما هو الدين فيجب أن نبحث فيه من العارفين. Al-Rumani's speech is eloquent, it's gracious, it's measured and refined. The Buyid Emir is a Dawla Bakhtiyar whose present praises him, stating, indeed, his speech is judicious, and I don't see any harm in it or any misjudgment. And Tawḥīdī at this point intervenes and says, the reason the Emir is a Dawla Bakhtiyar said this was to encourage a response from Abu Abdullah al-Basri. However, rather than responding to this courteous invitation, Tawḥīdī reports that the great leader of the Basran Mu'tazila turned yellow in color, became visibly nervous. He said nothing. At this point, the organizer of the event, Abu al-Wafa al-Muhandis, realized that something was amiss with the great Sheikh Abu Abdullah. And Tawḥīdī implies that Abu al-Wafa was partial to him. And so he intervenes. He states, the Sheikh Abu Abdullah is sick. He attended this session only on account of paying homage to the ruler. One of his students will be taking his place. It isn't right that he should tire himself and fall back into and risk a more serious illness. Then Abu al-Wafa brokered the new arrangement, stating to the opponent Al-Rumani, "O Sheikh, you can select any one of his students to be your interlocutor. However, al-Romani refused this arrangement, stating that there is no need for him to speak with any of Abu Abdallah's students. Rather, he avers, the point of this gathering was that the speech between Abu Abdallah and himself would be recorded for posterity. Al-Romani repeats again that the rationale for this arrangement had been that the students of Abu Abdallah and those of his own school had long been in contention with one another, and those at the gathering would finally decisively settle the points of dispute between them and stop the controversy that was raging between their two groups. Now, at this point, sensing the reductio ad absurdum, the Emir Izz-ad-Dawla Bakhtiyar steps in to attempt to salvage the event by encouraging the audience to come up with something else. That something else is a long speech by the Sheikh Shia, Abu Jaysh al-Khurasani, who takes the floor to voice opinions of the 12 Shia about the transmission of the Quran. Now, what is notable about this section of the debate is that there is only one person talking at length, and his overly long speech is reported as a monologue that is interrupted only by the Sheikh himself pausing to restate his claims. When he pauses, the Emir Izz-ad-Dawla Bakhtiyar, himself inclining towards 12 Shiism, praises Abu al-Jaysh, the speaker, stating that he has no rival in this field. And here too, Tawḥīdī represents a failure, a failed debate, in which the speaker gives no room for any discussion, disputation, or objection. Tawḥīdī reports that the gathering ends with a refutation by the Sunni Abu Hamid al-Mawarudi. However, he does not record the precise details of it, stating that these matters fall outside the purview of his book. Now, readers would have undoubtedly understood Abu Abdallah to have been the loser of this debate. Tawḥīdī drops enough hints even to suggest that the Sheikh was merely feigning illness because he could not really defend his positions. This debate, Tawḥīdī records in his book entitled The Akhlaq-e-Wazirain, The Morals of the Two Viziers, a work he wrote in 373-983 for Ibn Sa'dan, the Buyid Vizier in Baghdad. In this book, Tawḥīdī famously attacks a Sahib ibn Abad, the Buyid Vizier of Rai, modern-day Tehran, who counted the Sheikh Abu Abdallah al-Basri among his most esteemed interlocutors and teachers. Attacking Abu Abdallah al-Basri was attacking the great Sahib. But more interesting than this point of politics, I think, is the way that the debate dramatizes how the good and noble ideas of a debater, like the noble Sheikh al-Romani, who despite being gracious, eloquent, and intellectually astute, could not succeed in doing anything. The message of this account seems to be that one could bring all of the most intelligent people to a gathering, have the support, albeit fleeting, of the Buyid emirs for this debate, and nevertheless, things could go terribly wrong. The long diatribe of the Sheikh of the Shia that closes the debate, I think, once again shows how the spaces for rational inquiry could be filled up with so much talk. From his many other works that include examples of thoughtful disputation, we must in some sense imagine that Tawḥīdī saw virtues in the culture of intellectual debate. Yet his work could also portray how disputation, like all human speech, was flawed and limited. Shadows that betray the source of light, Tawḥīdī's descriptions of these debates provide a glimpse of that era in greater detail and afford another perspective from which to see. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mo. That was fabulous. And thank you to both of our speakers so far for sticking to the allotted time so scrupulously. I'm going to waste all of that kind of the gains that we've made. Ayman, may I very, very quickly share a screen from my own side? First, there's since Mo made a reference to another work of al-Tawḥīdī's, I feel compelled to quickly note that in fact the principal work of Tawḥīdī's, or the one that he's most famous for, is available from New York University Press, no less, for the low price of $40 US. If you don't have this already in your in your sort of course pack, then ask your lecturer to put it in whatever course you're taking, and if you're a lecturer, an exam or desk copy will be available. It is not a work in debate so much as in questions and answers, but if you ever wondered about why laughter is contagious or why there are mounters, al-Tawḥīdī has an answer for you. Now with that, I will try to finish sharing if I will be allowed to do that. Okay, there we are. Also, if you have questions for Maurice or John, feel free to already put them in the question and answer field. We will get to questions and answers once all of our 4 presenters have done their work. With that, I will turn this over to Ayman Shihadeh, who's one of our senior research fellows, as well as reader at the School of Oriental Studies in London. Please, Ayman.
Thank you very much, Taneli. So in this short presentation, which is really a slimmed down version of a much longer paper, I'll explore a pre-modern view on the role of passion in debate and in scholarly research more broadly. And I'm going to focus on, sorry, how do you, okay, I need to, yeah. And I'm going to focus on a well-known text written by Fakhruddin al-Razi, the famous late 12th century philosopher, theologian, jurist, and Quran exegete, whose views on this question are representative of a broader intellectual tradition in pre-modern Islamic thought. The text is a record of several debates with other scholars, which he engaged in during an extended stay in Transoxania, roughly modern present-day Uzbekistan. And it's obviously a one-sided record. It's a fascinating text, which works at several levels. At a personal level, it's a text in which al-Razi shows off his dialectical skills. So I've also shown that there's also an important methodological dimension to the text. It basically shows how research methodologies and doctrines can be subjected to rigorous scrutiny in face-to-face debate, and how some emerge out of this process as more compelling or adequate than others. The theme that, so yeah, I've done this in this book. The theme that I'm interested in here, passion, appears in debates, mainly in debates in which a fellow philosopher called Sharafuddin al-Mas'udi takes center stage. He's the subject of this book, which came out not so long ago. Razi records 4 debates he had with al-Mas'udi, and one prominent aspect of his portrayal of al-Mas'udi is that the latter has a rather emotional, above all irascible character. Whether or not this is an accurate characterization of al-Mas'udi is besides the point here. Razi describes al-Mas'udi's anger, sometimes vividly, no less than 11 times in this text, which I'll go through very quickly. And the philosophical, theological, and legal problems that they discuss are of little relevance here. So in one debate, Razi discusses a legal question with al-Mas'udi and other scholars. Razi opposes their view and defends a contrary view, and al-Mas'udi gets very angry, as you can see. These are just quotations from the text in which Razi refers to al-Mas'udi's anger and other emotions. In another debate, we're told that al-Mas'udi, who was a practicing astrologer, was discussing a serious astrological questions with a group of colleagues. A great planetary conjunction occurred in 1186, and astrologers were predicting devastating natural disasters, massive flood, storms, and so forth. So this al-Mas'udi and his colleagues were discussing these very serious questions, and al-Razi comes along and basically says, you know that astrology is not a real science, don't you? And this obviously sets the cat among the pigeons. Al-Mas'udi became furious and challenged al-Razi to justify his position, which al-Razi did, but his own interlocutor went ballistic. A long debate on the scientific credentials of astrology ensued. At one point, al-Masudi became incoherent and started shaking. In another debate starts with al-Masudi being ecstatic because he had just found and bought 2 precious books, including one by al-Ghazali, whom he held in high regard. What al-Razi does is basically to rubbish both books. As a consequence, al-Masudi got so angry his color changed. As al-Razi carried on bashing al-Ghazali, al-Masudi grew even angrier and descended into imbecility. In another debate, we're told that al-Masudi turned from red to yellow. So, al-Razi's rather comical portrayal of his interlocutor may seem flippant and frivolous, but it actually makes a serious point about scholarly method. And funnily enough, we find a clue of this in a philosophical work by al-Masudi himself, where he associates the psychological faculty of anger with prejudice and partisanship. A similar association underlies al-Razi's portrayal of al-Masudi in this work. He describes him as being quick to anger, as at his interlocutor's criticism of authority, due to his entrenched emotive attachment to certain individuals, texts, or doctrines, or his opposition to others. So, for instance, in one debate, al-Razi says, I said to al-Masudi, that is, if we're going to descend here into anger and tumult, then we had better end this discussion. But if we want to engage in a proper scholarly exchange, then we should keep calm and composed. There are several other indications in the text that al-Razi considers the passion associated with partisan bias to have a decisive impact on the rational faculties. And they do so in 2 major ways. Partisan bias does so in 2 major ways. The first is that it tends to affect the manner in which one reports, interprets, and hence understands the views of others. al-Razi refers to an earlier source and says that its author misrepresents the views of his opponents because of his extreme bias. And in another debate, he accuses al-Masudi of misrepresenting one of his own, that is al-Razi's, views in exactly the same way. The second impact of partisan bias and passion, which often follows on from the first, is that the desire to champion certain views or authorities and to refute others tends to result in uncritical and hence specious reasoning, a point that comes to the fore at various points in these debates. So in conclusion, I would say that one of al-Razi's principal objectives in his portrayal of al-Masudi in this text is to show how face-to-face debate not only serves to showcase and to scrutinize competing doctrinal positions and research methodologies, but can also expose the subjective passions by which they are often motivated and shaped, which are generally not conveyed so clearly in written discourse. What al-Razi portrays himself as advocating, above all, is dispassionate research, which is to say, scholarship that is motivated not by the desire to champion partisan positions, but rather by a desire for knowledge, which requires a sound and critical method, in which neutrality and level-headedness are of the essence. This is not to say, of course, that al-Razi was a neutral, dispassionate thinker. Certainly not. This would be too naive a conclusion. But it is nonetheless significant that he advocated dispassionate inquiry and that he was very much mindful of it. Thank you. I think you need to unmute. You need to unmute, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. My copy of al-Mas'udi is always by my side. My copy of al-Razi, I think, is downstairs. Let us turn to our final speaker of the evening, Caitlyn, Olson, also one of our Humanities Research Fellows, who is going to introduce us to no fewer than 160 debates. Please go ahead, Caitlyn.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Well, so first off, thank you so much to Martin and to Taneli for moderating, Alex and Raya for all the work that they do, and of course to the other speakers. So in my 10 minutes, I'm going to discuss a text from the turn of the 8th/14th century in the Maghreb. The text is titled Uyun al-Munadarat, which might be translated as choice disputations or select or prime disputations. And it presents a series of theologically focused historical disputations, less formal than scholarly debates, proceeding from the dawn of creation through pre-Muhammadan prophets, through early Islamic times, and almost to the present day of the author. In what follows, I will briefly introduce the author of the text, explain its structure in a bit more detail, and then consider what sorts of lessons the text is aiming to impart and who the intended audience for those lessons might be. The author of this text is named Abu Ali Omar al-Sakūnī, and he died in 717/1317. Very little is known about al-Sakūnī, but according to an introductory study to the print edition of the Uyun by the late Tunisian historian Saad Ghorab, al-Sakūnī came from a prestigious family of scholars, which migrated from Sevilla in present-day Spain to Tunis when the former city was conquered by Catholic forces in the middle of the 13th century. A particular scholarly focus of both al-Sakūnī and the figure who seems to be his father, the first person here, Muhammad ibn Khalil al-Sakūnī, was theology, or in Arabic, ilm al-kalam, usul al-din, ilm al-Tawḥīd, and I've listed the known theological works of father and son here. One striking feature of several of these texts is their unusual creative format. For example, Arba'un Mas'ala fi Usul al-Din, or 40 Matters in Theology, presents the core points of creed by examining them in 40 short, digestible discussions. Lahn al-Awam fi ma yata'allaq bi ilm al-kalam, or the misstatements of the common folk with regard to theology, is a warning to the educated and semi-educated not to say all the theologically problematic things that roll off the tongues of the broader populace. And the text is filled with examples of these problematic statements. Uyun al-Munadarat, this text of disputations, likewise fits this mold, with its discussion of theological content through a series of debates. And al-Sakūnī himself explains this format as follows. I aim to explain theology in a way such that ears are eager to listen, that comprehension becomes easy for minds, and that its acquisition is facilitated for whoever desires to know, by way of this text, the truth of the precepts of belief. God inspired me in this task with a method whose benefit is close at hand and whose profit is expected by the munificence of God. For I had seen that hearts are inclined to love listening to what had occurred in earlier times, and that most of the precepts of this noble science, meaning theology, were contained in choice disputations. al-Sakūnī's goal was therefore to write something catchy and engaging that would facilitate the learning of theological principles. What he produced was a text consisting in 160 disputations, set in largely chronological order. The first debates or exchange is one between Iblis and the angels, The second is between the prophet Noah and his people. And the next 14 likewise feature pre-Muhammadan prophets and messengers. Then from disputations 17 to 70 or so, there's a focus on the Prophet Muhammad and other early Islamic figures. And from 70 onward, the chronology moves into the era of the increasingly formalized discipline of theology, with an emphasis on scholars from al-Sakūnī's own theological school of Asherism. And the latest chronologically Ash'ari scholars that he cites are Fakhruddin al-Razi of Khorasan, who Ayman just spoke about. Although I will note there's no citations to Razi's text about debates, which is interesting. And the other latest Ash'ari scholar is Taqiyuddin al-Muqtara of Alexandria, and both these figures died in the early 7th, 13th century, so about 1 century prior to al-Sakūnī. If the text is meant to be didactic, so moving on, then what are the lessons that it imparts? To some degree, the disputations reflect their own historical moment, and thus they provide insights into historically significant topics. The pre-Islamic disputations focus a good deal on idolatry and monotheism, for example, and among the early Islamic disputations, we find such historically specific discussions as where to bury the Prophet Muhammad after his death. The text also offers an opportunity to graft Ash'ari stances and methods onto earlier times, and in doing so, to give them a sort of timeless, eternally true quality. The most striking example of this maneuver is the second disputation, which is also probably the longest. It runs to several pages. The disputations really vary in length. Some are as short as a paragraph, others are as long as this one. And as with other disputations, there's no setting given. So in contrast to some of the disputations that we just heard about from the other speakers, there's no sense of where we are, who's in attendance. There's really very little context. There's simply two parties that are allegedly facing off. And in this case of the second disputation, we have the beleaguered prophet Noah endeavoring over the course of his very long lifetime to sort of confront and bring his recalcitrant community around to monotheism. But the way that he does so sounds an awful lot like an Ash'ari theologian, particularly one engaged with the theological trends of the Maghreb. For example, Noah urges his people as a starting point to reflect on themselves and their changing physical natures and on the world around them in order to arrive at conclusions about the existence and the attributes of God. And this was a very typical way for Maghrebi theologians of al-Sakūnī's time to open a theological text. Noah then offers a proof for the existence of God that hews closely to that of the 5th, 11th century theologian al-Juwayni. And this proof, as I have argued elsewhere, was popular among Maghrebi theologians long after scholars in the Mashriq began to favor another proof. Finally, Noah enters into a discussion of which attributes are necessary, impossible, and possible for God. And this too was a common formula among Maghrebi theologians, later to be made extremely influential through the writings of the 9th/15th century theologian as-Sanusi. All told, this second disputation amounts to a full-fledged presentation of Ash'ari creed placed into the mouth of the prophet Noah. While the other early disputations are more subtle in their engagement with Ash'ari ideas and methods, these ideas and methods do appear. Al-Sakūnī often mentions the proofs, dala'il, hujaj, barahin, that people used in these exchanges, proofs being a foundational component of the Ash'ari theological method. And in terms of ideas, the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh, for example, contains references to the well-known Ash'ari topic of whether religious belief can increase and decrease. Through these kinds of moves, al-Sakūnī not only embeds scholarly theological teachings into, somewhat dramatic, exciting exchanges, but he also affiliates the ideas and methods being taught with illustrious figures of the past. Now, the final aspect of this text that I want to consider is that of audience. Who did al-Sakūnī think might benefit from this creative, catchy approach to discussing theological precepts? The truth is, it's hard to say. On the one hand, the other writings by al-Sakūnī and by his father indicate that they were of the school of thought, which considered that a basic knowledge of theology is crucial for all Muslims, regardless of intellectual capacity or their educational level. On the other hand, the Ḥayyān is quite a substantial text, both in terms of length, it runs to 300 pages in the print edition, and in terms of its fairly sophisticated content. One possibility is that the intended audience is similar to that of al-Sakūnī's text, Laḥn al-Awam, an audience that I would identify as a strata of people somewhere between highly educated scholars on the upper end and the hopelessly ignorant masses on the lower end. And these middle people might appreciate a compelling, catchy, creative presentation of theology while being willing and able to follow some of its more nuanced points. A further perspective on audience may be gained by considering the manuscript copies of the text. And I couldn't find images of those, but this is a manuscript of al-Sakūnī's Laḥn al-Awam. So we might consider the manuscript copies, although this line of inquiry takes us beyond al-Sakūnī's own moment. In the print edition of the Ḥayyān prepared by Ḥurab, he relies on 4 manuscripts, 3 of which were copied in the middle decades of the 12th/18th century in Tunis. One future area of investigation might then focus on the intellectual and educational context of that moment, as well as on the manuscripts themselves, to consider why and for whom the Ḥayyān had value. So to wrap up, the disputations in Ḥayyān al-Munāḍarāt function largely as a vehicle for conveying theological content, with the inherent drama of arguments helping to capture the audience's attention. Since the participants in the disputations are illustrious figures of the past, the inevitable triumph of their theological stances moreover takes on a particular legitimacy and satisfaction. And with that, I will leave it there. Thank you so much, and looking forward to a discussion.
Thank you so much, Caitlyn. That's amazing material. Okay, so now I'll invite all of our panelists back, and as well as just put the request out there that for all of our attendees, please, if you have a question for any one of our panelists, just type it into the Q&A field, and I will lift those questions from there as we progress. As we wait for those questions to come in, I'll also invite our panelists to raise a hand for a question to one another. I'll take the sort of the moderator's prerogative to first put a question to John, just to take this in order of presentation. One of the things that you portrayed in your presentation was the kind of the respectful discursive space that was opened up by these kind of opening remarks, the framing of this debate. Now, I can't help but kind of prod a little bit about this. After all is said and done, one of these disputants was at the caliph, and the other one is then however eminent, still just a Christian bishop. And so what I remember from that course that I took again very many years ago was that it tended to focus on, you know, the caliph querying what on earth kind of sense does the notion of the Trinity make, or kind of incarnation. And it seemed like what I was learning from was more of a one-way street. So in that particular interreligious debate, can you tell the audience about what kind of space did Timothy have to be querying the basis of Islam?
Yeah, I mean, Timothy was able to get away with saying quite a lot. I mean, so he offers his own interpretations of the Quran as itself teaching the Christian Trinity and the divinity of Jesus. So he's able to get away with saying things that you might think would not be acceptable or wise to say to a caliph. And it's precisely because he was so unabashedly in support of the caliph's political authority, and he talks about this in the debate. He discusses how God had taken away political authority from the Romans and given it to the Abbasids. That is, from the Byzantines and given it to the Abbasids. The other thing I would say at this point, is while it's true that that the fact that Timothy is speaking to the Caliph constrains to an extent what he can say, I think that sort of fits in with the overall point I was making, which is that there's a political dimension to this weak pluralism. The weak pluralism is designed to support this this regime in which everybody is able to express their point and sort of defend their own beliefs, but at the same time, Islam is given sort of the final word in the position of the Caliph. So it's a way to allow breathing room for other confessional points without threatening Islamic stances at the same time. But yeah, Timothy is able to get away with quite a bit. So just to give one more example, it's the mysterious letters that begin certain Quranic surahs. So in many of these cases, you have surahs that begin with 3 Arabic letters, right? And so Timothy interprets this as a hidden allusion to the Trinity.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you. Yeah, I have a second question that's actually addressed to all of the participants, but before that, I want to see if there's a hand that would be raised between the participants here, the panelists themselves. If not, then I'll as you think on a question, let me say this on the basis of Ayman's presentation, which again I found very edifying. So what Ayman presented in Fakhreddin's kind of an analysis of portrayal of Mas'udi's irascibility accords very clearly with what you find in al-Ghazali's revival of the religious sciences, where there's a similar kind of connection made between anger and disputational practices. And the link between those is through Plato's tripartite soul and especially Galen's presentation of this. So the idea is that, okay, you've got these different psychic forces of appetite, spirit, and reason. And what happens, according to, again, it's clear that al-Ghazali has a pretty well-developed picture behind this, where he says that, okay, you know, all of these learned scholars who are engaged in these disputations, they may be employing reasoned practices. So in a sense, you know, the formal procedures that they're employing might be, in the best case, completely fine. They're using dialectic more or less as it's defined in the Aristotelian tradition, but it's really the irascible soul that's driving the bus, because it's the desire to win that is kind of overwhelming here, so much so. And there's this lovely little passage where al-Ghazali says that it's like some of these disputants, when they're discussing theology, a holy person or a prophet could come, or God himself, I can't remember which one of these is, could come down and describe God's honest truth to these people. And they would rather hold on to their mistaken belief than accept the truth, because winning is more important to them than the cause of truth. And now, I've never been kind of think, I haven't thought for a very long time, at least, that al-Ghazali came up with this analysis himself. And so what you mentioned, Ayman, now about Fakhreddin clearly having a similar kind of thing in the background seems to indicate that, okay, that this kind of physiological, almost psychophysical explanation of what drives these disputants was a well-known trope at this point. So my question to all panelists is, have you come across this, and so sort of in kind of what kind of contexts? Please, anyone.
Well, if I could, yeah, I mean, definitely, it's there's a clear connection made between the irascible faculty and partisan bias. I think this is already in Avicenna. Yeah, what you see in al-Ghazali and in al-Razi is that is the notion that the ordinary people, those who are not non-scholars, basically, are motivated primarily by irascibility, by anger, by emotions, and a true scholar, someone who's, let's say a critical investigator, will be motivated primarily by thinking, by knowledge. But then the way, both al-Ghazali and al-Razi take the view that the absolute majority of scholars are not of this level, this high level. They are motivated both by emotion, by passion, and also by a bit of thinking, more or less. So what al-Razi, the way he portrays al-Masudi and others in this text, is that they are they pretend to be true scholars, critical thinkers, but in reality they are motivated by passion. So as you said, they go through the motions, the arguments, etc. But ultimately they just want to defend or to refute an authoritative view, or an authority, a person, or a group, or a doctrine, basically. So yeah, and I think, but I agree, al-Ghazali was key to, was a key element in this background. I think he unpacks this view, and what you see al-Razi doing is very much based on al-Ghazali's take on this.
Ayman, thank you.
Something along those lines, it's interesting for me to think about. There's a passage that I'm thinking of in the Muqabasat of Tawḥīdī, where it's an offhand statement, but it's about how at the court of Ibn Abad, the people would just shout the names Abu Ali, Abu Hashim, that the collective was somehow also stacking the deck, that there was a kind of an environment in which rational disputation was not allowed, that the airways had been clogged. And it's interesting to see then it's not that also in the 10th century there was, I think, to some degree also reflection about kind of the inner workings of the self, and also one's performance. I think that's written all throughout Tawḥīdī's works, and Sijistani, I think it comes from him. But there is that, I do like that notion that in some ways it's not just about the individual as well, even though al-Razi is sort of portraying it sort of as a, I actually have a question along these lines. One might, of course, read anger in disputation as not only blinding, but the irascible soul being encouraging, of course. Is there any tradition of that? Is there it being a spur to further inquiry, that the agonistic, after all, if the agonistic is so controlled that there is no room for sort of play, then I think we all know that from as teachers that there has to be. But is it anger that's the source of that play? Where do you think it comes from?
I'll just present one observation that occurred to me as Ayman was speaking, which was that, again, if you look at al-Ghazali, when he finds a defensible place for the irascible soul itself, like why did God put this kind of primal psychic force within us? He says, yeah, it's got its place. Everybody wants to defend their property, and by property he means wife also, which is not especially edifying. And then but then he says also that it's also there for the defense of religion, and so he says, if people didn't have that sense of needing to defend the honor of their religion, Islam would have disappeared. I've up until this time, I've always thought of this in the terms of just as kind of physical force of jihad. But it all of a sudden now it occurs to me that okay, this question of kind of defense of religion can also be expanded in the direction, I think, of thinking that okay, that these scholarly debates, again, as long as they're undertaken in defense of God's truth, or to beat back heretics, maybe put it that way, taking what the Al-Ghazali's picture certainly of dialectic is, at least there's that. So as long as you're not committed to winning so much as God's cause winning, it has an acceptable place. And maybe this is then a place for me to direct this in Caitlyn's direction, because again, this notion of Noah as Asherite theologian, I thought was fantastic. And so the idea that okay, that all of these, or at least some of these pre-Islamic prophets would also already have been defending the right religion as well. So the question about okay, so who were the imagined kind of opponents here? Are they are there features that emerge of, let's say, modern by Sakūnī standard heresies being projected backward into pre-Islamic times and so on?
Yeah, that's a great question. The opponents vary, and I guess I could say a couple things. So especially these pre-Islamic disputations, he seems to be lifting them in part from Quranic narratives. So he'll open it by mentioning, that Noah disputed with his people, that Hud's disputed with his people. And so the opponents in this case are, again, these are not scholarly debates of two somewhat even minds coming together. It's almost more of an act of persuasion with some confrontation. So it's Noah trying to bring his people around. With Moses, you get disputations with Pharaoh, as I mentioned. Okay, and then your question was thinking about who the opponents are, and then you had a further component to that.
Yeah. So the question was whether, for instance, kind of Islamic era heresies would be read backwards into these pre-Islamic times.
It's often harder to see that than I think we might assume or might expect. Certainly I think there's a sense that practices that tip into idolatry or polytheism sort of continue to appear. And so this is something that I think about in my broader research, where if the common people don't understand how amulets work correctly, they might think that there are powers in the universe other than God, and that this can be understood as a form of polytheism. So I think even the idolatry and polytheism of pre-Islamic times, scholars like al-Sakūnī would consider that to have an ongoing relevance into their own day.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much. Ayman, you have a hand up.
Yeah, again, this is a question for Caitlyn. Are there references to any actual face-to-face debates occurring in North Africa at Sakūnī's time? I get the impression that it's, everyone's more or less believing the same thing. So are there, references to debates?
Not in this text, and my own work mostly focuses on somewhat later centuries, so I wouldn't be able to say definitively, but some, I think perhaps less so along confessional lines, but some of these other texts by al-Sakūnī and his father do contain small fleeting anecdotes about their own exchanges they've had with people. And again, they're less debates, but more exchanges and corrections that happen. So al-Sakūnī's father has a story, I think he's like at a funeral, and the khatib says something that he means to be, theologically sound, and slips up, and al-Sakūnī's father kind of takes him aside and corrects him. So yeah, not anything really amounting to full-fledged debates, although again, this is not my exact area of specialty, so there may yet be exchanges like that. But I think these sort of didactic, edifying exchanges among Muslims becomes an important thing, as they're sort of trying to raise the floor on people's knowledge of just basic Islamic precepts.
Thank you, Caitlyn. Any final questions, observations at this point? We have had a couple of very gracious thank you notes through the Q&A function, and for my part, I want to also to thank everybody. Here we go. Okay, question for Dr. Olson. Caitlyn, you get the spotlight here. Elaborating on the social context of al-Sakūnī's disputation, is there some component of this text that attaches to his status as an emigre? Okay, so that's, yeah, excellent. Are other scholars with a similar profile engaged in writing similar texts?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I really wish we knew more about al-Sakūnī. You know, when I looked for some entries in Tabaqat works, it basically says that he's an emigre. He wrote a text or two. So I think one would need to do more digging around the Andalusi emigre context in Tunis of that time. But I can think, for example, that 2 or 3 centuries later, as you're continuing to get this flow of emigres from Al-Andalus as more and more regions fall to the Catholic forces. And certainly, I do know that in later centuries, you have polemical texts even being written in al-Ḥayyān, so clearly, which is Spanish and written in Arabic text. So I do think at moments of this emigration, you have people sort of with different audiences in mind and different polemical goals in mind.
Thank you very much. Yeah. That is, again, it's really, really good to consider this kind of context. If there are no further questions, then I have to thank all of our panelists, all of our participants for a really, really stimulating session. It was really also fascinating to see this kind of almost speed dating kind of thing in action. But I felt, for my part, I felt like the presentations really also spoke to each other's concerns, and for my part, I hope that we can take these discussions further as we move along. It's a great example of how the Humanities Research Fellowship program can produce these kinds of synergies. Thank you, everybody, once more. Have a wonderful evening, and good night for now.
Thank you, Taneli.
Thank you.